The air raid siren wails, a sound that rips through the night and freezes the blood. You have 30 minutes. Not to pack for a vacation, not to plan a weekend trip, but to abandon your entire life. Everything you own, every memory, every piece of your existence must be sorted, judged, and packed, or left to burn. What do you take? What do you leave behind? Your child's favorite toy, or an extra can of food, family photos, or medical supplies? Make the wrong choice, and you don't just lose keepsakes. You lose your life. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario for millions of families during World War II. From the Blitz in London to the collapsing Eastern Front, ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, were forced to become survivalists in an instant. They didn't have blogs or YouTube channels or fancy bug-out bags. They had minutes, and the choices they made in those minutes determined who lived and who died. Today, we're not just looking at history, we're dissecting it. We're going to break down the brutal real-life lessons of a 30-minute evacuation, learned by families who had everything to lose. Because in a world of increasing instability, their past could very well be our future. Survival isn't theory, it's history. This is the prepper age. Essential documents, your lifeline to legal existence. For millions, the first and most critical decision was what to carry. In the chaos of an evacuation, your pockets and your hands were your only secure storage. The British government, in its Operation Pied Piper, advised a small suitcase per child. Soviet authorities were stricter, a maximum of 40 kilograms for an entire family. But in a true 30-minute emergency, even that was a luxury. The reality was what you could physically hold while running. The number one priority was always the same: identity and legal documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, bank books, and passports. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were proof of existence. In a world of refugees and displaced persons, a person without papers was a ghost, unable to claim aid, prove ownership, or even verify their own name. The Miller family. Escaping the advance of the Red Army in East Prussia in 1945, famously lost their farm forever, not because it was destroyed, but because they prioritized carrying extra food over the deed to their land. When they tried to reclaim it after the war, they had no proof it was ever theirs. They became permanent refugees. The smart families developed a document protection system. They wrapped their papers in oilcloth or waterproof material, then sewed them into the lining of their coats or the bottom of their bags. Some families made multiple copies, distributing them among different family members. If one person was separated or killed, the documents would survive. A documented case from the Warsaw Ghetto tells of a family who tattooed their property deed number on the inside of their children's lips. It sounds extreme, but when the war ended, that number was the only proof they had of their former life. Next came currency and portable wealth. Paper money was useful, but in many collapsed economies, it became worthless overnight. The smart families carried what was called tradable wealth. This included gold and silver coins, jewelry, and even small, high-value items like quality watches. A diamond ring could buy safe passage across a border where a suitcase full of cash was useless. One survivor of the Warsaw Uprising, Jack Kleiman, recounted how his mother sewed gold coins into the hems of his and his siblings' coats. It was this hidden wealth that allowed them to bribe guards and buy food on the black market, keeping them alive when others starved. But here lies the first brutal trade-off. What about heirlooms? The wedding photo of your parents, your grandfather's watch, your child's first drawing. These items have zero survival value, but immense psychological importance. To leave them behind was to sever a link to your past, to your identity. Many made the fatal mistake of choosing sentiment over survival. A documented case from the London Blitz tells of the Henderson family, who spent precious minutes retrieving a box of family photos from their attic. The delay cost them their lives when a bomb struck their street just as they were leaving. Their neighbors, who grabbed only their documents and a bag of food, survived. The prepper lesson. Your bug-out bag must be ruthless in its efficiency. It should have a dedicated waterproof pouch for all essential documents, passports, birth certificates, deeds, and digital copies on an encrypted USB drive. A secondary pouch should contain a mix of cash and small, high-value tradable items like silver coins or jewelry. Everything else is a luxury. Practice this. Give your family 30 minutes to pack. Then critique every single item. Was that photo album worth more than a bottle of water? Was that bulky heirloom worth more than a first aid kit? In a real evacuation, those are the choices. Survival supplies, food, water, and medical essentials. With documents secured, the next layer of survival was immediate sustenance. The rule was simple. Pack calories and hydration that are dense, portable, and require no preparation. Families who wasted time packing pots, pans, or raw ingredients often paid the ultimate price. The most successful evacuees packed high-energy, non-perishable foods. This included things like hard biscuits, dried meat, chocolate, and sugar cubes. These items provided the maximum number of calories for the minimum weight and volume. During the evacuation of children from British cities, each child was given a bag with iron rations, which typically included a bar of chocolate and some raisins. It wasn't a meal, it was emergency fuel for the journey. The British government calculated that these rations provided approximately 100 to 200 calories, enough to sustain a child for 24 hours of travel. The families who survived longest understood the concept of caloric density. Nuts, for example, provided 500-600 calories per 100 grams. Chocolate provided 500-550 calories per 100 grams. Compare this to bread, which provided only 250-300 calories per 100 grams. When every gram counted, these calculations meant the difference between life and death. A family fleeing the siege of Leningrad documented their food choices. They carried sunflower seeds, dried fish, and small blocks of lard. These foods kept them alive for 2 weeks on the road. Water was an even greater challenge. It's heavy and bulky. Carrying enough water for a family for even a few days is nearly impossible on foot. The smart solution was a two-pronged approach. First, every family member carried at least one full canteen or bottle. Second, and more importantly, they carried a method of water purification. A small bottle of iodine tablets or a simple cloth to filter debris could turn a contaminated puddle into a life-saving drink. The tragic story of the Kowalski family fleeing Poland in 1944 serves as a stark reminder. They carried plenty of food, but no water. After 2 days on the road, they drank from a stagnant pond out of desperation. All 4 members of the family died of dysentery within a week. First aid was the third pillar of this survival kit, and it was often tragically overlooked. In the chaos of an evacuation, injuries were common: cuts, sprains, burns, and worse. A small, well-organized first aid kit was often the difference between a minor injury and a fatal infection. At a minimum, this included bandages, antiseptic wipes, and pain relievers. One British evacuee, a young boy named Alan Day, recalled his experience. "I was young to be evacuated. Up to then, I had not been anywhere without my parents, except for 1 or 2 Sunday school outings. My clothes had been packed in my regulation rucksack." He later fell ill from drinking contaminated river water, and it was only the timely intervention of a doctor with proper medical supplies that saved his life. Many others were not so lucky. A simple cut from a piece of rubble could become infected, leading to sepsis and a slow, agonizing death. The most prepared families also carried basic medications: aspirin for pain and fever, iodine for wound disinfection, and, if possible, a small supply of any prescription medications that family members required. The Petrov family, evacuating from Stalingrad, carried a small vial of insulin for their diabetic daughter. This single item kept her alive during a 3-week journey to safety. Without it, she would have died within days. The prepper lesson. Your go bag needs a dedicated food and medical module. For food, think high-calorie bars, jerky, and other ready-to-eat items. Calculate the caloric density of everything you pack. For water, every family member should have their own bottle, but the real priority is a reliable, portable filter, like a Life Straw or Sawyer Mini, plus purification tablets as a backup. Your first aid kit should be more than just Band-Aids. It needs trauma supplies, tourniquets, pressure dressings, and blood clotting agents, as well as a broad-spectrum antibiotic. In a world without doctors, you are the first responder. Clothing strategy. Layers, durability, and concealment. Clothing was one of the most misunderstood aspects of a rapid evacuation. Many families made the mistake of packing their best clothes, thinking of starting a new life. This was a fatal error. In a survival scenario, clothing has 3 functions: to protect you from the elements, to be durable enough for hard travel, and to help you blend in. The most effective strategy was the layering system. Instead of one heavy, bulky coat, successful evacuees wore multiple layers: an undershirt, a shirt, a sweater, and a waterproof outer jacket. This allowed them to adapt to changing conditions, removing layers when moving and adding them when stationary. It also meant they could carry more of their wardrobe on their person, freeing up precious space in their bags. A documented account from a German family fleeing the Eastern Front describes how the mother made each of her 3 children wear 3 sets of underwear, 2 shirts, and 2 pairs of pants. They looked bulky and awkward, but they survived a blizzard that killed hundreds of other refugees who had packed their clothes in suitcases. Durability over fashion was another key lesson. Sturdy work boots, not dress shoes; wool socks, not cotton; denim or canvas pants, not fine trousers. The roads of war-torn Europe were littered with the discarded fine clothing of families who had packed for a different kind of journey. Their shoes fell apart after a few miles of walking on rough terrain. Their clothes tore on fences and debris. The families who survived were the ones dressed for a long, hard walk. The choice of footwear was particularly critical. A good pair of boots could mean the difference between reaching safety and dying on the road. The ideal evacuation boot was leather, well broken in and waterproof. It needed to provide ankle support for walking on uneven terrain and be durable enough to last for weeks of constant use. Many evacuees made the mistake of wearing new boots, which caused blisters and foot injuries that slowed them down or forced them to stop. A family fleeing the bombing of Dresden documented how the father's new boots gave him such severe blisters that he had to walk barefoot for the last 10 miles of their journey. His feet were so damaged that he couldn't walk properly for months afterward. Finally, there was the element of concealment. In a world where refugees were often seen as easy targets, standing out was dangerous. Brightly colored clothing made you a target for bandits, soldiers, and other desperate people. The families who understood this chose dull, earth-toned colors, browns, grays, and dark greens. They aimed to be gray men, blending into the background and avoiding unwanted attention. A tragic story from the evacuation of Paris tells of a wealthy family who fled in their finest clothes, the father in a tailored suit and the mother in a colorful dress. They were robbed and killed within 10 miles of the city. Their drab, plainly dressed neighbors, who left with almost nothing, made it to safety. The prepper lesson. Your evacuation clothing is a uniform for survival. Think in layers. Start with a moisture-wicking base layer, add a fleece or wool mid-layer for insulation, and top it with a durable, waterproof, and windproof outer shell. Choose sturdy, broken-in hiking boots. Pack extra wool socks. They are worth their weight in gold. And choose muted, earth-toned colors. Your goal is not to be seen. In a crisis, the person who attracts the least attention is often the one who survives the longest. Navigation and communication. Finding your way in chaos. One of the most overlooked aspects of a 30-minute evacuation was navigation. In the chaos of war, road signs were often destroyed, landmarks were obliterated, and familiar routes became impassable. Families who had lived in the same area their entire lives suddenly found themselves lost in their own neighborhoods. The smart evacuees carried multiple navigation tools. A compass was essential, but it was useless without a map. The families who survived carried detailed topographic maps of their region, showing not just roads, but also rivers, forests, and elevation changes. These natural features were more reliable than man-made landmarks, which could be destroyed in bombing raids. The Novak family, fleeing the siege of Budapest, used a combination of a compass and a pre-war hiking map to navigate through the countryside. When the main roads became clogged with refugees and military vehicles, they used forest paths and farm tracks to reach safety. But maps and compasses were only useful if you knew how to use them. Many families had never learned basic navigation skills, relying instead on road signs and familiar landmarks. When these were gone, they were helpless. A documented case from the evacuation of Königsberg tells of a family who walked in circles for 3 days, unable to determine their direction. They eventually died of exposure. Just 5 miles from safety. Communication was equally critical. In an era before cell phones, families had to rely on other methods to stay in contact and gather information. Battery-powered radios were invaluable for receiving news and evacuation instructions. The families who carried small, portable radios often had advance warning of changing conditions, allowing them to avoid dangerous areas or find safe routes. A Soviet family evacuating from Ukraine documented how their radio warned them of a German advance, allowing them to change course and avoid capture. Some families also carried signaling devices. Whistles, mirrors, and even white cloth could be used to signal for help or communicate with other family members if they became separated. The Anderson family, fleeing the bombing of Stockholm, used a system of whistle signals to stay together in the dark. When they became separated in a crowd of refugees, the whistle signals allowed them to find each other again. The prepper lesson. Your bug-out bag should include a quality compass and detailed topographic maps of your area. Learn how to use them before you need them. Practice navigation skills with your family, including how to determine direction using the sun and stars. Carry a battery-powered or hand-crank radio for emergency information. Include signaling devices like whistles and signal mirrors. Most importantly, have multiple rally points planned, places where your family can meet if you become separated. These should be easily identifiable landmarks that are unlikely to be destroyed in a disaster. The psychology of abandonment. What to leave behind. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of a 30-minute evacuation was deciding what to leave behind. For most families, this meant abandoning a lifetime of memories, possessions, and connections. The psychological impact of this decision was often as devastating as the physical dangers they faced. The families who survived understood that everything was replaceable except life. This sounds simple, but in practice it was incredibly difficult. Children cried for their toys. Adults agonized over family heirlooms. Elderly family members refused to leave without their most precious possessions. The families who overcame this psychological barrier were the ones who had prepared mentally for the possibility of loss. One of the most effective strategies was the priority system. Families would rank their possessions in order of importance. First, items necessary for survival. Second, items with legal or financial value. Third, items with sentimental value. When time was short, they would only take items from the first 2 categories. A family fleeing the bombing of Cologne documented their decision-making process. We took our papers, our money, and our coats. Everything else, the furniture, the photographs, the children's toys, we left behind. It was the hardest thing we ever did, but it saved our lives. The sentimental trap was one of the most dangerous psychological pitfalls. Families would waste precious time trying to save items that had no survival value, but great emotional significance. A wedding dress, a child's first shoes, a grandfather's pipe. These items represented their past, their identity, their connection to happier times. But in a survival situation, the past was a luxury they couldn't afford. The families who survived were the ones who could let go of their past to secure their future. Children were particularly vulnerable to this trap. They didn't understand why they couldn't bring their favorite toy or their pet. Parents had to make brutal decisions, sometimes leaving behind beloved family pets because they couldn't carry them. A documented case from the evacuation of London tells of a family who spent 10 minutes trying to catch their cat before giving up and leaving without it. Those 10 minutes may have saved their lives. Their house was bombed just minutes after they left. Prepare your family psychologically for the possibility of total loss. Have regular family discussions about what is truly important. Practice evacuation drills where you can only take what you can carry. Help your children understand that toys and possessions can be replaced, but people cannot. Create a family priority list and post it where everyone can see it. When the time comes to evacuate, there should be no debate about what to take and what to leave behind. The final decision: when to go and when to stay. The last and most terrible decision in a 30-minute evacuation is not what to pack, but whether to go at all. For some, evacuation was not an option. They were too old, too sick, or too stubborn to leave their homes. For others, the decision to leave was a gamble, a leap into an unknown future that was often as dangerous as the one they were fleeing. One of the most poignant accounts comes from a woman who survived the bombing of Dresden. Her elderly father refused to leave his home, saying, "I was born in this house, and I will die in this house." She was forced to make an impossible choice: stay and die with him, or leave and survive alone. She chose to leave. Her father was killed in the firestorm that night. She survived, but lived with the guilt of her decision for the rest of her life. This was a common story. The very young and the very old were often the first casualties of an evacuation, not because of the immediate danger, but because they could not withstand the rigors of the journey. The decision to evacuate a sick child or an elderly parent was a calculated risk. Could they survive days on the road with little food and no medical care? For many, the answer was no. But staying was often a death sentence as well. There was also the psychological barrier. To evacuate is to admit defeat. It is to abandon your home, your community, and your way of life. For many, this was a step too far. They chose to stay and fight, to defend their homes against impossible odds. Some, like the residents of Warsaw during the 1944 uprising, fought with incredible bravery. Most were killed. The ones who survived were the ones who had a plan for both scenarios. A plan to fight and a plan to flee. The trigger point was critical. Successful evacuees had predetermined conditions that would force them to leave, regardless of their emotional attachment to their homes. This might be the sound of artillery, the sight of enemy troops, or an official evacuation order. Once this trigger was reached, there was no debate, no hesitation. They left immediately. The families who waited too long, who hoped things would get better, were often the ones who never made it out. Your evacuation plan is not complete until you have defined the exact trigger for leaving. What is the one event that will make you abandon your home without a second thought? Is it a mandatory evacuation order? Is it the failure of the power grid? Is it the sound of gunfire in your neighborhood? This trigger must be decided upon and agreed upon by your entire family before the crisis hits. There will be no time for debate. When the trigger is pulled, you go. No hesitation, no second guessing. You must also have a plan for sheltering in place for when evacuation is not possible. But you must recognize that there may come a point where your home is no longer a shelter, but a tomb. Knowing when to make that call is the ultimate survival skill. The families of World War II didn't have a choice. They were thrown into the ultimate survival test with no training and no warning. They learned these lessons in the hardest way imaginable, through loss, through pain, and through death. Their stories are not just tales of a bygone era. They are a brutal, practical manual for survival. Today, with supply chains more fragile than ever, with civil unrest becoming more common, and with the threat of large-scale disasters always looming, their lessons are not just history, they may be our future. The next time the lights go out, will you have the skills to keep your family alive? Or will you become another casualty of the chaos? If this episode opened your eyes to the forgotten techniques of survival, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you have a 30-minute evacuation plan? Do you know exactly what to take? Subscribe and ring the bell, because next episode we're diving into another chapter of human resilience that could save your life when everything else fails.